The wind howled against the windows of Carter's diner, a haunting, lonely sound that echoed through the empty booths. Outside, the snowstorm raged on, erasing the highway and swallowing the last traces of civilization. Inside, Emily Carter stood behind the counter, wiping a rag over the same spot, over and over, as if erasing a stain only she could see. It was a ritual she'd picked up in the months since the new interstate opened 6 miles west, pulling traffic and customers away from their little diner. A lifeline severed by concrete and steel. Now, the lights flickered dimly, casting long shadows over the empty tables. The sign outside swung listlessly in the wind, the closed side clattering against the glass. Jack Carter sat in his usual spot by the window, the place where he used to watch the trucks rumble in and out of the parking lot.
Now.
He stared blankly at the swirling snow, his wheelchair pulled close to the glass. The years on the road had carved lines into his face, each wrinkle a map of lost highways and fading memories. The CB radio he once used to guide fellow drivers through blizzards and black ice now sat silently in the corner, collecting dust. Emily glanced toward the pantry. A few cans of soup, some stale bread, and a nearly empty jar of peanut butter. It was all they had left. She knew Jack could sense the desperation in the air, but he never said a word. His eyes remained fixed on the snow, as if searching for something out there, something he had lost. Then, the bell above the door jingled. Emily's hand froze mid-wipe. A man stumbled in, shaking snow from his coat. His boots left wet prints on the floorboards as he approached the counter. "Evening," he said, his voice rough and wind-bitten. "Any chance you're still serving?" "Highways closed, and every place I passed was dark." Emily swallowed, her throat tight. We're closed." The man's shoulders slumped, and Emily noticed the weariness in his eyes, the way he cradled his hands against the cold. Outside, headlights blinked through the falling snow. More trucks, more drivers. Stranded. Hungry. Alone. Emily glanced at Jack. He said nothing, but his jaw clenched, a subtle tightening that only she would notice. It was the same look he used to wear when he'd hear a call for help over the CB radio, back when he was CB King. The voice that guided lost drivers through the storm. Emily turned back to the man, her heart pounding. "Come in," she said, forcing a smile.
"Get warm."
The man nodded gratefully and took a seat at the counter. Emily headed to the kitchen, her hands shaking as she pulled the last cans of soup from the shelf. Ethan, the young line cook, leaned against the doorframe, his face pale and uncertain. "Ethan," Emily said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Heat these up. All of them." Ethan blinked. "But that's all we have left." Emily took a deep breath. "Then we'll serve all we have." Jack wheeled himself closer, his eyes still on the snow outside. More headlights blinked through the storm. More trucks. More men looking for refuge. Emily's heart ached as she watched them stumble through the door, shivering, stamping the cold from their feet, eyes hollow with exhaustion. For the first time in months, the diner was full, not with paying customers, but with men seeking warmth, seeking comfort, seeking anything that could make them forget the storm raging outside. Plates clattered. Coffee sputtered in the pot. Voices rose and fell, a chorus of weary laughter and quiet gratitude. Jack sat alone in the corner, his hands gripping the arms of his wheelchair. He stared into the crowd, but his eyes remained distant, somewhere far away on a road he couldn't travel anymore. Emily moved between tables, pouring coffee, passing out plates, offering smiles that didn't quite reach her eyes. And as she refilled the pot for the third time, she couldn't shake the feeling that the storm outside was nothing compared to the one still raging inside these walls. 2 days later, the ground would shake, and something extraordinary would roll into town. But tonight, the storm raged on, and inside Carter's diner, Emily served everything she had left. The storm raged on through the night, its icy fingers pressing against the glass like a relentless phantom. Inside Carter's diner, the air was thick with the scent of stale coffee and desperation. Plates clattered. Spoons scraped against bowls, and voices murmured low, the sound of strangers finding warmth in each other's company. Emily moved between tables, pouring the last of the coffee, her hands trembling beneath the weight of the empty pot. Ethan scraped the bottom of the soup pot, ladling out the final spoonful into a chipped bowl. The young cook looked up at Emily, his face drawn and pale. "That's it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We're out." Emily swallowed hard, the knot in her stomach tightening. Outside, the wind howled louder, a cruel reminder that the world beyond these walls was cold and unforgiving. In the far corner, Jack sat quietly, his eyes fixed on the door as if expecting someone to walk through. Beside him, a young trucker named Tyler huddled over a cup of weak coffee, his hands trembling. "Ever heard of CB King?" Tyler asked, his gaze flicking toward Jack. "My dad used to talk about him all the time. Said he was the best voice on the road. Kept him company on long hauls." Jack's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. The memories lingered. Ghosts of nights spent talking drivers through whiteouts and ice storms. But that was before the accident, before the silence swallowed him whole. Emily forced a smile as she passed by. "Jack was a driver too," she said, hoping to coax Jack into the conversation. "Back in the day." Tyler's eyes widened. "You knew CB King?" Before Jack could respond, the door swung open, letting in a gust of frigid air. Mike stepped inside, his coat dusted with snow, boots leaving wet prints across the floor. "Heater's out," he said, his breath fogging the air. "I tried fixing it, but it shot." A murmur of concern rippled through the room. Emily's heart sank. The last of the coffee was gone, the food had run out, and now the only source of warmth was slipping away. Jack wheeled himself forward, his face set with a determined grimness. "Got any duct tape?" he asked Mike. Mike blinked. "Duct tape? Yeah, I think so." "Why?" "Because sometimes," Jack said, "all you need is a little stubbornness and a lot of duct tape." He nodded to Mike, and together they headed toward the back, leaving Emily standing alone in the middle of the room. She watched as Jack disappeared into the darkness, his silhouette swallowed by the shadows. For the first time that night, Emily allowed herself to close her eyes, to let the exhaustion seep in. The sound of wind battered the windows, and in that moment, she couldn't shake the feeling that the storm wasn't outside. It was right here, in this room, threatening to consume everything they had left. The night stretched on, the wind outside a constant howl that gnawed at the diner's walls. Inside, the atmosphere thickened with silence. The cold seeped through every crack, stealing warmth from bodies and breaths. Emily rubbed her arms, feeling the chills set into her bones. Jack and Mike had been gone for nearly half an hour. Ethan paced behind the counter, his jaw clenched, eyes darting to the door every few seconds. Tyler sat slumped over his coffee cup, the steam long gone, his gaze fixed on the empty bowl before him. One by one, the other truckers dozed off in their seats, wrapped in their heavy jackets, leaning against one another like a pack of stray dogs seeking warmth. Emily moved quietly, draping a thin quilt over the oldest man, his grizzled beard twitching in sleep. "You look just like my dad," she whispered, tucking the quilt under his arm. "The same way he used to sleep after a long haul." A soft creak echoed from the back door, and Emily spun around, her pulse quickening. Jack and Mike stepped inside, covered in snow and grease, their faces tight with exhaustion. Mike shook his head as he slumped onto a stool. "It's patched up for now, but it won't last." Jack rolled himself forward, his jaw set, his hands filthy. "I need the radio," he said, his eyes hard. "The CB radio." Emily blinked, surprise flickering across her face. "The old one? The one that hasn't worked in years." "I can get it working," Jack said,
his voice firm.
"but I need it
now."
Without another word, Emily hurried to the back storage room. The air was colder here, the shadows deeper. She rummaged through boxes and old blankets until her fingers closed around something cold and metal. The CB radio. Jack's old lifeline. The one that had once made him a voice on the road. A hero to the lost and stranded. When she returned, Jack was already clearing a space on the counter, shoving aside empty cups and plates. Mike grabbed a wrench and handed it to him. "You think you can still do this, CB King?" Jack's eyes met Mike's, a flicker of the old fire igniting in his stare. "Watch me." For the next hour, the diner fell silent, save for the soft clinking of tools and the occasional curse muttered under Jack's breath. Emily watched as Jack worked, his hands moving with a familiarity that seemed to wake something up inside of him. The old radio crackled, hissing static that filled the room with the sound of life. Jack adjusted the knobs, his brow furrowed in concentration. The truckers watched in silence, their breaths fogging the cold air, as if the entire room was holding its collective breath. Then, finally, a voice broke through the static, distant, garbled, but unmistakably human. "Breaker, Breaker, anyone out there?" Jack leaned forward, his hand trembling as he reached for the mic. For a moment, his gaze flicked to Emily, then to the truckers, then back to the mic. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing as he brought the mic to his lips. "This is CB King," he said, his voice rough but steady. "You got me." Loud and clear. The static crackled, filling the room with a chorus of distant voices, truckers scattered across the snowbound roads, calling for updates, searching for connections. Jack's jaw tightened as he listened, each voice a haunting echo of a life he once knew. "CB King, you still out there?" A voice crackled through, hoarse and familiar. Jack gripped the mic tighter, his knuckles white. "I'm here," he said, his voice carrying a weight he hadn't felt in years. "You got me." A pause, then. "Damn. It really is you."
Thought you were gone, man.
Jack swallowed, the words catching in his throat. Emily stood behind him, her eyes fixed on his face. She hadn't seen this look in him for a long time, that spark, that fierce sense of purpose. "I'm here," Jack repeated, his voice firm. "What's the situation out there?" "Interstate's shut down," the voice replied. "Snow's piled up high. Got a rig jackknifed at mile marker 142. Driver's stuck, no way to get him out." Jack's eyes flicked toward Mike, who stood by the window, watching the storm rage on. "Mile marker 142, Jack murmured, his gaze far away. "That was my route." Mike nodded, his expression grim. "Could take hours to clear." Jack pressed the mic again. "Hold tight. Keep your engine running if you can.
Help's on the way."
Tyler leaned forward, his eyes wide. "You can still do that? Still get them through?" Jack didn't answer. He just kept his gaze on the swirling snow, his mind already racing down the old roads, mapping out every turn, every hazard. Memories of the nights he'd spent guiding drivers through storms, talking them through fear, through loneliness, through that desperate, freezing dark. "Hey, CB King," another voice broke through. "You remember Kansas? Black Ice 98? You kept me sane that night." Jack's mouth quirked up at the corner, a faint, weary smile. "Yeah," he said, his voice a little warmer now. "I remember." Emily's heart tightened as she watched him, the man she married, the man she thought she'd lost. For a moment, it was like seeing him again, whole and unbroken. But the moment didn't last. The wind outside howled louder, shaking the walls, and the heater groaned one last time before sputtering out completely. The lights dimmed, flickered, then held. A chill swept through the room, and the truckers shivered, huddling closer together. Mike cursed under his breath. "That's it." Jack lowered the mic, his jaw clenched. "We need more fuel for the generator." Ethan shuffled nervously in the corner. "But we're out. Use the last of it keeping the coffee hot." Emily's shoulders slumped. She glanced around the room, at the men who had come to her for refuge, at Jack, who was starting to slip back into that dark, empty place. "We'll find a way," she said, forcing herself to sound certain. "Yeah," Jack muttered, his voice hollow. "We always do." The temperature dropped rapidly, the air thick with the biting chill of the storm. The generator was down, and the silence hung heavy, as if the storm had swallowed the diner whole. Emily wrapped her arms around herself, her teeth chattering as she glanced around the room. The truckers huddled together, using their jackets and blankets to ward off the cold. Tyler rubbed his hands together, blowing into them to keep them warm. "Any chance that heater's coming back on?" he asked, his voice tinged with desperation. Jack was hunched over the CB radio, the mic still clutched in his hands. His gaze was far away, lost in the static. Emily stepped closer, laying a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Jack, we need to do something." Jack's jaw tightened. "I know." Mike stood by the window, peering out into the snow. "Visibility's nearly zero. I can't even see the trucks out there. If we don't get some heat in here soon," he trailed off, his eyes meeting Jack's. "People are gonna freeze." Jack's shoulders slumped. The weight of his own helplessness pressed down on him, heavier than the storm outside. He was supposed to be the man who knew the roads, who could guide people through the worst of it.
But now,
Without fuel, without power, he was just a man in a chair, holding a mic that could no longer reach the world. Emily took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm. "There has to be something we can use. Anything." Ethan's voice piped up from the kitchen. "What about the cooking oil? We've still got a couple gallons back there." Jack's eyes lit up. "It's not much, but it's something.
get it.
Now." Emily and Ethan rushed to the back, their footsteps echoing in the empty kitchen. The shelves were nearly bare, just a few cans of beans and a half-empty jar of peanut butter. Ethan grabbed the 2 jugs of oil, his hands shaking as he hauled them back to the dining area. Jack nodded, rolling himself closer to the generator. "Mike, help me rig this up." Mike crouched down, his face tense with concentration. Together, they worked in silence, pouring the oil into the makeshift fuel tank, rigging wires, and adjusting knobs. Emily stood nearby, holding a flashlight steady as the men worked. Finally, after what felt like hours, Mike stepped back. "Okay," he said, wiping sweat from his brow. "Try it now." Jack's hand hovered over the power switch. He closed his eyes, said a silent prayer, and flipped it. For a moment, nothing happened. The room remained dark, cold, silent. Then, with a sputter and a roar, the generator kicked to life. The lights flickered on, casting a warm, golden glow over the room. The truckers let out a collective sigh of relief, some even clapping as the heaters sputtered back to life, pushing back the cold. Emily exhaled, a tear slipping down her cheek. "You did it, Jack." But Jack didn't answer. He just stared at the CB radio, his face shadowed and haunted. Because while he'd managed to bring the diner back to life, he knew the road outside was still a frozen, deadly expanse, and there were men out there waiting for a voice to guide them home. The generator whirred, the heaters hummed, and the warmth slowly crept back into the room. But despite the newfound heat, a chill lingered in the air, a tension that wound tight around Jack as he sat alone at the counter, the CB radio still in his hands. The truckers huddled together in small groups, murmuring in low voices, their eyes darting toward Jack and the radio. Outside, the storm continued to howl, battering the windows with icy fists. The men inside couldn't shake the feeling that they were safe, but just barely. Mike leaned against the counter, his eyes on Jack. "You gonna say something?" he asked, voice gruff but gentle. Jack's gaze remained fixed on the CB radio, his knuckles white around the mic. "They're out there," he said, more to himself than to Mike. "Stranded. Alone. Just like I was." Mike's expression softened. "And you were the one who got them through it. You still can." Jack swallowed hard. His throat was tight, his chest heavy. Memories flooded back. Nights spent on the road, talking men through storms, his voice a lifeline that kept them sane. But now, the man holding the mic felt more like a ghost than a hero. Emily stepped forward, her eyes locked on Jack. "You saved them before, Jack. You can do it again." Jack shook his head. "That was then. I was a different man." "No," Emily said, her voice firm. "You're still that man. You just forgot how to believe it." Jack's jaw clenched, his eyes burning. Before he could respond, the CB radio crackled to life. A voice, faint and trembling, echoed through the static. "Breaker, breaker. Is anyone out there?" My rig's dead, heater's out.
I'm
So damn cold. The room fell silent. The truckers exchanged uneasy glances. Some looking away, others staring at Jack, waiting. Jack's breath hitched. His hand hovered over the mic, his fingers trembling. Emily took a step closer, her hand resting on his shoulder. Jack, she said softly.
They need you.
Jack closed his eyes, exhaled a long, shuddering breath. Then he lifted the mic to his lips, the old, familiar weight settling against his palm. "This is C.B. King," he said, his voice steady, firm. The man he used to be shining through every word. "I hear you, brother. I'm here. Hold tight. I'm not going anywhere." The voice on the other end let out a sob of relief. Thank God. And just like that, the room seemed to breathe again. The truckers leaned forward, listening as Jack guided the man through the storm, his voice a beacon in the darkness. The static crackled and popped, but Jack's words cut through, strong and clear. "You're gonna make it," Jack said.
Just keep talking to me.
"You're not alone." Emily watched him, tears stinging her eyes, her heart swelling with something she hadn't felt in a long, long time. Hope. The snow finally eased up, settling into thick, heavy drifts against the diner walls. Inside, the generator hummed quietly, its rhythm a fragile heartbeat in the lingering cold. Jack slumped against the counter, exhaustion etched into every line of his face. The CB radio sat in front of him, the mic still in his hand. He had been talking to the stranded driver for hours, guiding him through the worst of a storm. Now, the room was quiet, the men inside finally drifting into restless sleep. Emily approached Jack, setting a steaming cup of coffee beside him. "How's he doing?" she asked softly. Jack rubbed a hand over his face. "He made it. Found a rest stop about 10 miles up. They're taking him in." Emily exhaled a long, relieved breath. "You did it, Jack." Jack shook his head. "I just talked." "That's what you always did," Emily said, her eyes soft. "And it was always enough." Jack swallowed, his gaze dropping to the mic. His fingers trembled as he set it down, the weight of the night pressing against his shoulders. "But for how long?" he muttered, more to himself than to her. Before Emily could respond, the bell above the door jingled, and Mike stepped back inside. His coat was dusted with snow, his cheeks red from the cold. But his eyes shone with something fierce, something Emily couldn't quite read. "You need to see this," Mike said, jerking his thumb toward the parking lot. Emily and Jack exchanged a glance before Emily grabbed Jack's coat, draping it over his shoulders. Together, they followed Mike outside, into the icy dawn. The storm clouds had cleared, revealing a sky streaked with the first hints of sunrise. And in the parking lot, lined up one after another, were trucks.
Dozens of them.
Their engines rumbled softly, a low, collective hum that filled the air. Men climbed down from their cabs, trudging through the snow toward the diner. Some held steaming thermoses, others carried blankets, coats, supplies. "Word got out," Mike said, his grin wide. "CB King's back on the air." Jack's mouth opened, but no words came out. His eyes swept over the crowd, men he hadn't seen in years, men he thought he'd never see again. There was Ron, the old-timer who Jack once helped through a night of black ice, and Jimmy, who'd blown a tire on a mountainside pass with nothing but Jack's voice keeping him calm. One by one, the men approached, clapping Jack on the back, shaking his hand, welcoming him back to a world he thought he'd lost forever. Emily stood beside him, her hand slipping into his, her heart swelling with pride. "You did this," she whispered. Jack shook his head, tears stinging his eyes.
"No."
"They did." The snow had stopped, but the cold lingered, a biting chill that seeped through every crack in the old diner. The parking lot was now a sea of trucks, their engines still idling, headlights piercing through the thinning fog.
Inside,
the atmosphere buzzed with life, voices raised in laughter, old friends reuniting, strangers bonding over cups of steaming coffee. Emily moved through the crowd, refilling mugs. passing out plates of whatever scraps they could muster. Ethan was in the back, flipping the last few pancakes, his face flushed with the warmth of the grill. Every seat was filled, every booth packed. It was as if the diner had come back to life in the most unexpected way. Jack sat at the counter, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, his gaze fixed on the crowd. The CB radio rested beside him, its antennas still vibrating slightly from the last call. He hadn't spoken a word since the men began to arrive, and Emily could see the way his shoulders had slumped, as though the weight of all those eyes was too much to bear. "You okay?" Emily asked, setting a fresh pot of coffee beside him. Jack nodded, his jaw tight. "I didn't ask for this," he said, his voice low. "They came because they thought. Because they know who you are," Emily said, cutting him off gently. "They know what you did for them. And they came back to do the same for you." Jack's eyes flicked up, meeting hers. "What if I can't? What if I'm not that guy anymore?" Before Emily could answer, a deep voice boomed through the room. "Hey, CB King." It was Ron, the old-timer Jack had once guided through a blizzard. He stepped forward, holding a battered CB radio in his hands. "Been holding on to this since '98. You gave it to me when mine fried out. Figured it was time it came home." Jack's throat bobbed, his hand shaking as he reached for the radio. It was heavy in his palm, the paint chipped and worn. But it was still the same piece of metal that had once connected him to the world, to the men out there fighting through storms, clinging to his voice as their last lifeline. The room fell silent. The men watched as Jack ran a thumb over the radio surface, his eyes glistening. Emily stepped closer, resting a hand on his back. "Say something," she whispered. "They're waiting." Jack swallowed, lifting the radio to his mouth. His gaze swept over the room, at the men who had come back to remind him who he was. Then he pressed the button, his voice breaking through the static. Strong and sure. "This is CB King," he said, his voice carrying through the diner, through the parking lot, through the miles of road that stretched endlessly beyond. "You got me." Loud and clear. A cheer rose up, filling the room, a sound that shook the walls and echoed into the dawn. And for the first time in years, Jack felt the warmth of it, not just the heater's glow, but the fire of belonging, of being needed, of being heard again. Emily leaned against the counter, her eyes shining as she watched Jack, her heart swelling with a hope that was once lost but had finally come home. 1 year later, Carter's Diner was no longer the forgotten, empty shell it once was. The sign outside had been freshly painted, its bold red letters gleaming under the midday sun. Trucks packed the lot, their chrome shining, engines idling as drivers filed inside, laughing and slapping each other on the back. Inside, the walls were covered in photographs, snapshots of drivers and rigs, of Jack at the counter with his radio, of Emily handing out plates of steaming food. A mural of Jack, his old CB radio in hand, now hung prominently behind the counter. Beneath it a sign read, "CB King, a voice on the road." Jack sat in his usual spot by the window, a cup of coffee in one hand and the CB radio mic in the other. But this time, he wasn't alone. Tyler sat beside him, a notepad in his lap, his young face intent as he listened to Jack's instructions. "Always keep a steady voice," Jack said, pressing the mic. "Doesn't matter how bad it gets. Your voice is their anchor." Tyler nodded, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Got it." Jack handed him the mic. "Try it." Tyler swallowed, lifting the mic to his lips. "Breaker, breaker. This is Tyler. You got me." Jack grinned, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Louder. Let them hear you." Meanwhile, at the counter, Emily poured coffee for a group of drivers. "Heard this place is kind of a legend," one of them said, a grin spreading across his face. "CB King still running the show?" Emily chuckled. "First coffee's on the house," she said, sliding the mug across the counter. "And so's a story, if you're staying long enough to hear one." Outside, the sun hung high in the sky, glinting off the windshields of the parked trucks. The wind that once howled through the empty lot now carried the sounds of engines, laughter, and the crackling voice of Tyler, finding his rhythm over the radio. In the distance, Jack watched the horizon, his eyes scanning the long, open road. The same road that had taken so much from him, but had now given him back something far more valuable. A purpose, a family, a reason to keep talking. And as the voices echoed through the radio, through the walls of the diner, and across the wide expanse of asphalt, Jack closed his eyes and listened. Not to the static, not to the wind, but to the life that had found its way back to Carter's diner, and to him.